Today we're talking about flooding and what's the future.
I'm a farmer and I'm a cider maker. My family has lived in the village since 1770. We flooded, last time my father's house flooded, we flooded in 1928. And then we flooded in 2013 and 2014, and the effect was dramatic. In the 14 flood, my father was out of the house for 14 months before it was got back together again. When we flooded, there were all sorts of theories of why we flooded. Possibly some farmers are responsible a little bit because of the growing of maize, and that causes a lot of soil erosion. Yeovil is and Taunton are the two fastest growing towns in the country. And that allows all this water, when it falls on Yeovil, hits the river in next to no time. There's vast areas of concrete. But the real cause, from my point of view, is in 1994 to 5, the new Environment Authority took over the management of the river. And they sold off all of the dredging equipment. The official figure says, the EA figure, that our river system is 42% blocked. But the central argument is that we didn't dredge. We stopped dredging after 1,000 years. But on simple terms, Bridgewater Bridge is 3 arches, 1 big arch, 2 small arches. The 2 small arches at the side were completely blocked, 100% blocked with silt. The bottom of the big arch was up 5 feet because of silt. Official figure was over 50% blocked. People said, well, when they dredged the Bridgewater Bridge, it wouldn't make any difference. But I don't think you need to be a brain surgeon to work out that if you have a bridge and you open it up by 50%, then chances are 50% more water would go through there. We need a river dredged. The government was forced, in the form of Eric Pickles, to apologise on behalf of Her Majesty's government for the incompetence of what had happened. And we need dredging. Dredging will restore us. It might not save us in 100 years from global warming, but if we manage the river system, we've all got 100 years left.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for keeping to time, and thank you for giving a very cogent argument in favour of dredging as being an important part of the solution. I think we might hear now from George, who's going to speak next, about maybe other things that must be part of the mix. Perhaps the interesting thing will be contesting between how much of each should be considered, or whether it's both and, rather than either or.
There are 2 components to whether disastrous floods happen. 1 is the amount of rain that falls, and 2 is what happens to that water once it hits the land. And the entire catchment turns out to be crucial to that second dimension, not just what's there at the bottom of the catchment, the floodplain, which of course is where, from the point of view of householders and farmers, most of the dire impacts are going to happen, but what happens much further up as well. So to start at the top of the catchment, ideally what you want there is trees. Trees are quite magical as far as attenuation is concerned. And there was one study in Mid Wales done by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which showed that the rate of infiltration down through the soil where trees were growing was 67 times higher than the rate of infiltration under sheep pasture. Sheep pasture behaves almost like concrete. It's quite remarkable. The water just flashes straight off it, down into the nearest watercourse, and then woof, it's down towards the floodplain, causing a problem. But if it can go through the soil first, then it filters down slowly through the soil and is slowly released from that soil. We're all aware of this when we're talking about the tropics. You know, the DFID, the government agency, gives millions of pounds to other countries to say plant trees in the catchment, in the hills, because that'll stop floods and mudslides downstream. But Here, bizarrely, we have exactly the opposite policy. The thing you do is to deal with the stuff at the top of the catchment, where so many of the really significant things are happening, and try to get rid of that sort of perverse spending and reforest the hills, reforest the river gullies, put in reed beds, put in the sort of features which slow the water down. So it's a question of slowing the flow as much as possible. And I'm delighted to see that there's a local group here, Hills to Levels, which are trying to spread that message and saying we've got to deal with the entire catchment. So number one is stop the silt coming down into the river. And what is silt? When it's on the land, we call it soil. It's a good thing when it's on the land. When it's in the rivers, we call it silt. It is a bad thing when it's in the rivers. So stop the silt getting into the rivers in the first place. That's absolutely crucial. And you stop it by a whole lot of soft engineering, letting nature do the work for you, rather than pouring concrete and sending blinking great machines in to scour away the beds of the rivers. But very precise targeted dredging like that on one bridge, that sort of thing, can have an effect. Generalized dredging along the course of the river, if it has any effect at all, you're basically speeding the water down to the next urban pinch point and causing more of a problem down there. And the dredging itself, it seems to make such sense, but all you're basically doing is moving the problem from one part of the river to another without actually dealing with the roots of the problem and where it comes from. And you're very likely, in many cases, as a Royal Society report on this very case in 2014 here in the Somerset Levels showed, either to have no effect at all or actually to make things worse. Like everything else, we have to approach this in a holistic fashion, not a piecemeal fashion. We have to approach it in a long-term fashion, not a short-term fashion. We have to approach it in a long spatial fashion, not a short spatial fashion where we're just looking at what's immediately under our noses. And that means considering the whole catchment. It means working with nature, not against nature. It means making sure our money goes as far as possible, so we use it as effectively as possible. And it means creating a situation which is going to cause as few problems to the people who live downstream as it possibly can, while inconveniencing people upstream as little as possible. And that is called natural flood management. That I would commend as by far and away the best means of dealing with the situations which have caused such havoc in the Somerset Levels and elsewhere. Thank you.
So, firstly, it's obvious that we're dealing with a changed world and a changed climate. So we hear from Julian that things have been done like this for hundreds of years, and I'm sure he knows a lot more about that through his family history than I do. But the problem is, the reality we're living with now is different from what it was 100 years ago, and it will be different again in another 100 years. It's a very vulnerable, it's a very special place here on the Levels, as I'm sure we all agree, but it's also a place that's particularly vulnerable to climate change. And in a way, it's like the first point where you see the kinds of changes we need to be making when we're living with a changed climate. Flooding is becoming a part of our lives and something we're having to learn to adjust to and to live with right across the country, although the Somerset Levels has particular features there. If there's discussions about whether dredging should happen or shouldn't happen, some of that will happen in terms of national policy, but much more it needs to happen right here on the ground in Somerset, and that's why the new Somerset Rivers Authority will have a particular role to play and must engage local people, engage local communities, and have input from the people that actually live in this area and understand how it works. One of the issues that I think we need to tackle very seriously because of its impact on climate in a positive way is the quality of our soils. What we're seeing is massive loss of topsoil, and the quality of the soil that we have greatly diminished. And this strategy of just using chemicals to replace that will not last. It's running out right across Europe, and we're seeing declining yields because of that. But it's also very damaging in terms of flooding, because it doesn't require us to value the soil or to improve the quality of that. And a lot of the farming methods that we use at the moment actually kill active living soils, and we need to be doing the reverse of that. That's not only good in terms of agriculture, it's also good in terms of climate, because healthy living soils actually hold and capture a great deal more carbon. And one of the things we can see in terms of flood management is that a soil that holds water is also a soil that holds carbon, and therefore it's achieving all sort of multiple benefits in terms of the environmental issues. And we also think that the focus on whole catchment management, which is a key part of the European law, the Water Framework Directive, should be followed a lot more closely in terms of what happens at DEFRA. But in fact, DEFRA splits the river management between local authorities because that makes sense to them politically and bureaucratically. But obviously it doesn't make sense in terms of the rivers and how they're managed. Just moving on quickly to some of the good examples of flood management that I've seen. I am also a big fan of the Hills to Levels project. I've also visited the Exmoor-Myers partnership further south in Somerset. That is an absolutely fabulous example of using nature to achieve these water retention and carbon capture benefits. Because effectively, once you get above a certain height above sea level, then if you don't drain land, it will absorb water and it will produce peat because of the cold and wet conditions. And so the reason we don't have more peat on Exmoor is because we had drainage channels dug to improve the grazing and the pasture. And what they're doing in that project is simply filling up, blocking up those drainage ditches so that the land continues to hold water and continues to hold carbon. And it's a tremendously efficient, effective and cost-effective way of achieving those benefits of carbon capture and water capture. And it's going to become more and more important, both as a way of stopping climate change getting any worse and in dealing with the consequences of climate change in terms of flooding. So I think one of the things we need to do very much in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy is take the emphasis away from income support for some people who are already quite wealthy, put a cap on the amount that farmers can be paid, and move that money into the greening measures, in which I include flood management greening measures. We need to insist that farmers provide public goods in return for the public money they receive, and flooding management in the upper catchment could be part of that. We need to also make sure that these farm-relevant aspects of water management and the Water Framework Directive get into the Common Agricultural Policy requirements for farmers, and we need the British government particularly to make sure that they do that. And we need to also really emphasise on this catchment management approach and make sure that the British government follows what is European law in terms of thinking about the whole catchment and river basin management.